Welcome, everyone, to episode 13 of the Ask Historians podcast. I'm incredibly excited today to present my interview with Snickeringshadow on the Tarascans, or the Purepecha, as they call themselves, as we will learn. It is quite possibly, and I don't think I'm exaggerating on this, the single largest and most comprehensive piece of pretty much anything you can find on the internet or in basically common pop media about this group. They are, for their relative importance in Mesoamerican history, fairly unknown to most people, aside from those of us who actually study it. I do a little back and forth with him about my own subject of interest, which is the Aztecs, but overall, Snickeringshadow just takes the ball and runs with it, so I hope you enjoy it. Oh, and this is part 1 of 2, so there's more to come.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is 400 Rabbits here for the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I'll be interviewing Snickeringshadow, a longtime user, recently modded onto the mod team, and our resident expert in the West Mexican, pre-Columbian group known as, so most people, the Tarascans. So, Snickeringshadow, I think one of the things that I want to start off by asking you is that who really are the Tarascans? Because that's not the name they call themselves, and it's not the name that they were called by their contemporaries, the Aztecs, which was the Michoacan. So what did they call themselves? Where did they come from? Who were these people?
Well, as for the first question, what did they call themselves? The truth is we don't really know. The word Tarascan comes from the Spanish Tarasco, and the currently accepted etymology for this is actually a little screwed up. Supposedly, when the conquistadors first arrived in the area, they started, it's a polite way to put this, I guess, would be they started taking native women, and so the local people started referring to the Spaniards as Tarasque, which in their language means son-in-law. So they were they were defining this word based on the relationship that they had with the Spanish, and the Spanish sort of took that as the name of the ethnic group. The modern ethnic group today calls themselves the Purepecha. However, Purepecha literally means commoner, and so this likely became the name of the ethnic group after the colonial authorities had sort of removed all of the nobility from power. So there were only common people, and when you asked them, what are you, they would say, I'm a common man. So we don't actually know what the name of the ethnic group was in antiquity. So the name Michoacan is the Aztec name for the area. That means land of the fishermen, and so that's not actually a name that they would have identified with themselves either.
So so what kind of language were they speaking? And actually, if I could go ahead and make probably the first of many digressions, because my own area is the Aztecs, and these are two kind of interrelated groups. Is that there's this long-running, perhaps not in not academic circles, but in popular idea that the Tarascans are migrants from South America. Meanwhile, the Aztecs themselves say that the Tarascans are actually a group of Aztecs, a group of Mexica, actually, that were left behind. The Mexica, while they were wandering away from Aztlan, stopped on the shores of Lake Texcoco, and they loved it there for a while, but, they were told by their god to move on. Some people disagreed, and while those people were out swimming, the Mexica stole all their clothes so they couldn't come after them, and then moved on to Mexico. And as a fun bit to this just so story, that's why the Mexica said, well, that's why the Tarascans don't wear breechcloths, because we stole them. So where did these people actually come from?
Okay, well, I can say for pretty sure they did not come from South America. That's almost certainly. Yeah, but why?
You probably know better than I. Why would the people say that?
Well, okay, so for a very long time there's a popular perception that the what we call the Tarascan Empire, which, by the way, the native name for the Tarascan Empire is the Kingdom of Tzintzuntzan. That's the literal translation, Irechequat Tzintzuntzani. So I'll probably use that more often when referring to the political entity. I also kind of want to try to avoid. I know I use the word Tarascan a lot because it's the commonly accepted term, but it can be kind of offensive to call modern people Tarascan, so I'm going to use Purepecha to refer to the language and the culture whenever possible. Mm-hmm. So the language they spoke was Purepecha. It's a linguistic isolate. It's not related to any other language in Mesoamerica, and its closest relatives linguistically are, I'm not 100% on this, but I believe Quechua in South America is their closest relative. But that's separated by like 10,000 years. So it's not like they were recently to the area. As to where they came from, this is a little kind of a complicated question because they were originally two different ethnic groups. There was an indigenous ethnic group that was living in the region prior to, going back to probably the Classic period. And then there was another ethnic group that moved into the area, which is identified in the historical sources as the Chichimecs. And this group they were nomadic peoples that came from the north, very similar to the Aztecs, which is probably why they have that similar
it's
origin.
Kind of a similar origin story with the Aztecs tracing their lineage back to Chichimecs. Yeah.
Right. However, the difficulty is in determining exactly who these groups were. The only real historical source we have is a document known as the Relación de Michoacan. There's a few minor sources, but that's the only big one, and it's really contradictory on what it says these different people were prior to the formation of the empire. At one point, it says that the Chichimecs and the native people spoke the same language, but that the Chichimecs spoke a different dialect. This seems a little strange, but at the time when it mentions that, the Chichimecs had already been living for a couple generations in this area, so they might have picked up the language as they came. In another instance, it says that the original inhabitants spoke Nahuatl, and that was replaced by the Purépecha language. That also seems rather unlikely. Given the archaeological and linguistic evidence, it doesn't look like there was a whole lot of major cultural shifts prior to the rise of the empire. So I don't really buy into that. There is a population of Nahuatl speakers, or there was a population of Nahuatl speakers living in the Lake Basin at the time. They were one of the largest ethnic minorities there, living at the time of Spanish contact. So I'm kind of inclined to go with what I consider to be the simplest explanation, which is that the chroniclers were just confused, and that the group that originally spoke Nahuatl was the Chichimecs, and that they adapted and learned the local language Purépecha once they moved into the Lake Basin.
So it was less the Purépecha coming into the basin than kind of being more the kind of autochthonous group that was already there that mingled with intercoming Chichimec groups.
Right. Well, this is actually I was very excited because this week I didn't think I was going to be able to talk about this on the podcast because I'm actually working on an archaeological project that's researching this time period right before the rise of the empire, and I didn't think I was going to be able to talk about it at all because it's all unpublished research, but thankfully just this
that's
week,
what we're here for, unpublished research.
Yeah, just this week the university issued a press release talking about some of this, so I can talk about it, but only what was released in the press release, and I'll link the press release in the post. But basically, there was this perception that there was the region that the Tarascan Empire arose in was a largely rural area, and that the urbanism that you see associated with the empire was a recent phenomenon, that they just sort of exploded out of nowhere with no prior urbanism. It's now looking like that's not true. Recent archaeological research has uncovered a large urban center. We're talking 12 square kilometers, 20,000 architectural elements visible from the surface. It's huge. Stone architecture.
And what's the time period on this?
Well, there's a range of time periods,
course,
but
yeah.
we found in the press release it says we found some copper alloy artifacts, which if Dorothy Hostler's chronology for metallurgy in the region is true, that means we're talking about the middle to late post-classic, which is this period right before the rise of the empire, or and perhaps leading up into the empire.
And so for people who aren't up on their Mesoamerican chronology, give us a date on this.
Okay, so the earliest use of copper alloys in the region that we know of goes to 1200 AD. So, and the earliest migrations, these Chichimec migrations, are believed to have happened in the late 13th to early 14th centuries AD. So, not too far apart.
But it's still actually preceding it, yeah.
Yeah, and that actually kind of segues into kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about today, which was the this migration story. The ancient Purépecha peoples. I'm not willing to rule out the possibility that they had some kind of pictographic script that they used for record-keeping purposes, but it doesn't appear that they used it for recording history because they had an oral history tradition. But it just so happened that there was a Spaniard who visited this area And they would have this big festival called Aquatea, where the high priest, who's known as the Petamuti, would get up and give his official history of the migration of the Chichimec peoples and the founding of the empire. And the Spanish priest happened to be there for this festival and took copious notes. So we actually have their legendary story for how it happened. But to sort of give you a little bit of background on the kind of governments we're talking about, the people living in the lake were living in what I'm going to call city-states. The indigenous term is Ireti. It's sort of I know you study the Aztecs. It's analogous to the Altepet. Yeah. So it's similar to the Altepet model of government is a good analogy. But basically, it's a large town or a city with its surrounding farming communities, sort of united under a political entity centered around a royal lineage. This was the predominant government of the people of the islands. Most of their or the people around this lake basin. And most of their subsistence was farming and fishing.
So when we are talking about, what is now based in a Mexican state of Michoacan, and particularly this one lake basin, then what kind of geographical characteristics are we talking about? What shaped, the people on the land?
Right. Okay. So basically, the Michoacan straddles the western end of what's known as the Central Mexican Plateau. You have this, the two mountain ranges, the Sierra Madre Occidental and Oriental, have this highland area between them, very high elevation, sort of a mild temperate climate. The western end of the Central Mexican Plateau basically goes right past the area where the capital, the future capital of the Tarascan Empire, the Zinzunzan, was located. And there's some mountains just on either side of that, and then sort of towards the southwest, it starts sloping down and towards tropical lowlands, and the climate becomes a lot more tropical. You get things like parrots and good land for cotton.
These would be what are called later the hotlands.
Right. Yeah, the hotlands. So, but the capital itself is located, about I would say 5,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level. So to put that in metric, I guess that's like 2,000 meters, somewhere around there. And it's mostly temperate. You have oak and pine forests. In the winter, it gets cold at night. It's a little. I think most Americans, speaking as an American, most Americans sort of see Mexico as either like tropical rainforests or desert, and this is neither. It's a humid, temperate highland environment.
Yeah, hence questions like, how did the Aztecs live in the jungle or something?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, nothing like that. I mean, it's the environment. If you've been to central Mexico, it's the same basically. It's the same environment. It's almost kind of the western end of central Mexico. Yeah, so these the cities were sort of scattered around the main area where the bulk of the story takes place, that would become the core region of the empire, was located in an area known as Lake Pátzcuaro, which is a highland lake in a giant valley surrounded by mountains. And you can actually go there today. The lake it's a little bit lower. The water level's a little lower than it used to be, so the lake's smaller, but it's still there. You can go visit it. So there were some islands in the lake. Some of these city-states were located on islands, although the ones that were on islands were typically pretty small because the island kind of limits how big you can get. But the islands sort of formed one political block. And then you had other city-states located along the mainland. And each of these city-states had its own sort of noble elite culture. And one of the things that's really interesting that you sort of see that kind of comes through the oral history, but you also get it in stereotypes that the Aztecs had about these people, which is that elite culture in this early time period was very much a party culture. There was a lot of alcohol consumption. It's mentioned that every time they introduce a new lord, every once in a while they'll say, "Oh, and he was a notorious drunkard."
And what were they drinking at this point? Is this
It's pulque. It's mostly pulque.
Yeah.
I think they also had maize beer, tezguino, but it's mostly as fermented agave sap. And there was occasions where, like on a festival day, that'll describe how the lords would wake up in the morning and just like start drinking with breakfast, and would just get completely drunk. And whenever one lord would offer food to another lord, they would often follow it with, "Here, have some of this. It'll sober you up a little bit."
So a bit of a contrast from the Aztecs declaring public drunkenness an executable offense.
Yeah, no, completely different. And the other thing was that in addition to the men drinking, the women were drinking too, right? The noble women were getting just as drunk as the men. And perhaps not surprisingly, there were a lot of extramarital affairs going on. It seems like everyone's like sleeping with everyone else. There's one famous event, a lord named Ottoman was sleeping with the wife of the Lord of Sherlock, with whom he was at war. So it's sort of like ultimate rubbing salt in the wound, right? You know, you're at war with a guy and you're boning his wife in the meantime.
So how much of this is actually kind of verifiable, and how much is this kind of, you know, tabloid history? You know, we've gotten the salacious details, but maybe not how the actual lived experience was.
Well, that's part of the issue, right? Because you have to remember this is coming down to us as the official history of the empire, and part of the reason why the guy who founded the empire was named Teriakuri. Part of his justification for doing this was that he saw the previous lords as decadent and wasteful, and not fulfilling. They're more concerned for, you know, having a good time than taking care of their sacred obligations, and so it's quite possible that this has been exaggerated somewhat. But there are a few later stories of the nobility getting drunk as well. So it's the truth probably is not quite as extreme.
There probably was some sort of drinking culture, of course, but maybe not the kind of, you know, debauched frat house living that it seems. Yeah. But I'm glad you brought up Teriakuri, because, you know, he really is the kind of the founding nucleus of what we, you know, eventually became to call the Tarascan Empire. You know, could you talk a little bit about him? Where did he come from?
Yeah. Okay, so Teriakuri was one of these Chichimek groups, right? And supposedly the lineage of his story starts with this migration. The guy who's the first credited ruler of that lineage. By the way, his lineage, Teriakuri's lineage, is known as the Wakusecha. There were a few different Chichimek families that are mentioned in the historical sources. One of them was Eneami, Sakapuyireti, and the Wakusecha. But the Wakusecha tribe, if you want to call it that, or, you know, family or lineage, is the one that was the one that founded this empire through Teriakuri. And it was started first by a guy named Tikatame, who was a Chichimek lord who moved down from the Zakapu Basin, which is another valley on the northern end of Michoacan. So supposedly these Chichimeks, who the sources make it clear they were largely hunter-gatherers, and they're either nomadic or semi-nomadic. There's a team of French archaeologists who's working in the Zakapu Basin right now that thinks that they might have found evidence for the original Chichimek settlements in that area, and it seems more like they were settling down in one place, building some, you know, semi-permanent structures, living there for like a generation or two, and then packing up and leaving and moving somewhere else. So they weren't so much nomadic in the sense like, you know, they just moved from place to place constantly, but rather they would settle down in one area and then hunt and gather in the local forests and then move on
to kind of, you know, when they had exhausted easy access of resources.
But this caused a bit of conflicts, right? These early Chichimek migrations caused some difficulties with the local people, because mainly, you know, the local people in the Zakapu Basin and also in the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin were settled peoples who were living in towns and cities, and they were largely farmers and agriculturalists. They weren't. Most of them didn't have weapons. I mean, the nobility might have had some, you know, sort of professional military background, but most of them were just farmers and craftspeople and stuff like that. These Chichimeks were seen as somewhat intimidating, is the impression we get. They wandered around in the forest. Sometimes they're described by the settled peoples as vagabonds or like homeless people. They saw them as these weird, you know, untrustworthy characters who wandered around the forest, but they were also carrying bows and arrows, and they were exceptionally good archers. There's a scene later where Teriakuri is visiting some other lord and of one of these settled peoples, and they're sitting around and they see this brightly colored bird like land in a tree or something nearby, and the lord is kind of joking around and, you know, poking fun at Teriakuri's Chichimek heritage and says, "You're a Chichimek, I bet you could shoot that bird." And so Teriakuri pulls out an arrow, notches it, and, you know, hits the bird dead on and kills it. And
you were right.
Yeah. The Lord was like so impressed. He like took the bird, and this is apparently like some tiny little bright colored bird, and took it around. Was like, "Look what he did. This is amazing." So
actually, yeah, this idea about the Chichimeks as both being kind of both, you know, looked down upon as, you know, ignorant savages, but also kind of, you know, praised for their kind of warlike, virile spirit. It tracks very well with, you know, the Aztecs as well, because that similar idea exists there with the fact that the Chichimeks came in and kind of were a revitalizing force to the Toltecs. You know, the Toltecs, of course, were this, you know, in the Aztec sense anyway, this highly advanced, civilized group. But, you know, all the groups in the Basin of Mexico pretty much can trace to some point, their lineage back to Chichimec migrations there.
Yeah.
I would say the one difference, though, and I think that we both know that this may come in a little more important later, is that the bow and arrow was actually kind of rejected by the Basin Maxenter groups as being, a sign of that primitiveness in favor of, odd darts and slings.
Yeah, well, this is what's interesting to me. I mean, if we go with the hypothesis that both of these Chichimec groups were Nahuatl speakers, what's interesting to me is that the Chichimecs that migrated into the Aztec region, dropped the bow and arrow and kept their local language, whereas the Chichimecs that migrated into the Lake Pátzcuaro region dropped their local language and kept the bow and arrow. It's a little kind of strange if that's the way that worked out. But yeah, but the story supposedly goes that this guy Ticatame, he was a leader of this Chichimec group, settled outside of a city-state known as Naranjan in the forest. And the Lord of Naranjan was kind of freaking out about this because, there's some Chichimecs that just moved into this forest in the mountain near his town. So he marries one of his daughters to Ticatame to sort of secure a strategic alliance, which, by the way, this was the standard practice for these communities, was if you wanted to turn a potential enemy into a friend, you would marry a daughter off or a sister
political
off.
Marriages,
right,
pretty common.
Very, very common. So, but the Ticatame then tries to explain to these settled peoples who've come with this embassy that, that's fine, we can be friends, but he says you need to understand something about our religion. We have these sacred hunts where we pursue these deer through the mountains, we shoot them, and we bring them as offerings to the gods. We're not eating the deer. It's a sacred hunt. It's part of a ritual. So if you happen to find a deer in the forest with an arrow in it, just leave it alone. Don't touch it. Don't eat it. Don't do anything, because that's part of our sacred religious traditions. Well, sure enough, time goes by, and one of these deer that Ticatame shoots gets away. So he goes back to his house and, tries to go makes a smaller offering to the gods before going out to go look for this deer that had wandered off as part of this sacred hunt. And he finds the tracks leading into a town that was subject to Naranjan. And he walks in there and sees he finds like a place where there's like a pool of blood in this field, like a maize field. And apparently the locals had sort of, found this. They were having a festival. They of course, had been drinking, as festival customs appear to go here. And they found this dead deer on their property and thought, let's cook it. We'll put it in the festival. So when Ticatame finds out that they cooked this sacred deer, he gets really upset and starts yelling at them. And a couple of the noblemen from the town start arguing with him. And during this argument, it kind of escalates, and one of the noblemen pushes Ticatame down. And Ticatame stands back up, pulls out an arrow, and shoots the guy that pushed him. Then he turns and shoots the guy next to him. So there's sort of right.
It's a little preemptive, but
right.
We all knew it was coming.
It's kind of like this idea of them being somewhat intimidating is seen as deadly archers that could snap at a moment's notice is maybe perhaps not entirely made up. There's some truth to that. But of course, this obviously doesn't go well. The king of Naranjan sends his soldiers out to go after him, and they kind of have this. It almost sounds like a Wild West style duel where Ticatame is taking cover behind the door frame of his house, firing off arrows. But of course, they outnumber him and kill him and drag him off. And his son packs them up and moves them south into Lake Pátzcuaro, and they settle on the northern end of the basin, live there for a couple generations. They suffer a weird omen, which is kind of an amusing story. Of course
there's an omen, yeah.
Of course, there's always omens. It's an amusing story, but it's not really related to the plot, so I'm going to kind of skip over that.
All right.
But
we can put it up in the discussion post. You can give a little side there.
If anyone's really curious, I can go into the details on the omen that moved them out of the area.
But it probably won't be my favorite Aztec omen, which is a talking vagina. But
oh god, no! Wow,
I'm sure it'll be interesting.
Oh, we should do a podcast on just different omens. That sounds interesting. So, anyways, we're trying to speed this up to get to Teriacody. Eventually there's two brothers. The Chichimec groups scatter after they leave this northern end of the lake basin, and some of them go one way, some of them go another way. But the story that's important is what happens to the Wakusech group. And at this time, the Wakusech were led by two brothers, Wapeani and Pawakume, and they move south towards what is today Pátzcuaro, which is on the southern end of the lake. and this would eventually become the first of imperial capital. So what happens then is that they marry they marry the daughter of a fisherman, and so the settled people of the islands, the islands dominate the southern end of the lake basin. There's a few large islands there. The largest of them was Shadok. Today, it is known as the island of Janitzio, and you can still go there. There's a giant statue of Jose Morelos on top of it, which, in ancient times there was a pyramid up there, but it's the
probably
same.
not Morelos.
Yeah, but you can kind of climb up in Jose Morelos' head right now and look out over the lake basin and you get some cool views.
So to return just real quickly back to the geography of the region was, because Lake Texcoco, was actually like several lakes which, connected during, following the rains. Was there also kind of this seasonal contraction and growth of the lake in Michoacan as well?
I believe so. There's another... My advisor would know the answer to this question. I'm not entirely sure.
We can put that aside. We can put a pin in that for now.
I know that it wasn't several lakes. It was one lake, and it was it's kind of L-shaped. If you can kind of imagine holding up your left hand and sticking your thumb out, that's kind of the shape of the lake. And the Pátzcuaro is kind of down where the thumb would be, the knuckle of the thumb.
And was there some sort of equivalent, as in the Basin of Mexico, of like chinampas, the floating gardens, which are not floating?
I don't think so. No, I think there were some agricultural the agricultural stuff mostly was on the mainland and on the mountainsides using terraces. But the people of the islands subsisted mainly through fishing because that's the island. It's like Shadok, for example. Today there's like 2,500 people on the island of Shadok, and it is packed. I mean, you can't it's extremely full, and I think it's probably reasonable to assume that Shadok probably had like 1,000 to 1,500 people in the past, but it was extremely densely occupied. There's no space for farmland because it'll take you like an hour to walk the circumference of the island. So they had to sort of survive based on tribute from the mainland in agricultural products, but also through fishing. And fishing was a major part of the economy, which is of course why the Aztecs called it the land of the fishermen. So these two Chichimec brothers managed to spot a fisherman who's sort of plodding his little canoe up and down the lake, and they kind of wave him over and they start asking him lots of questions about the different people living on the islands, which lords are with who, and then they eventually sort of reluctantly talk this fisherman into giving them a daughter to marry so that they can sort of learn a bit of the local culture and build connections that way. And so they end up marrying off this fisherman's daughter, and then they move south and settle down near Pátzcuaro and establish sort of a town there with their other Chichimecs. What ends up happening next is extremely complicated, and to understand why it happened the way it did, you have to kind of understand something about the local politics. There's a few major players in the lake basin at this time. There's Caricaten, who's the lord of Shadok, and he's Shadok is this island, and there's several other island communities, and each of these islands is not, some of them are really densely populated, but they're not very big, and so they've sort of formed a political bloc. There's, they've connected themselves through a series of marriage alliances and other political associations, so that the islands are politically quite united. There were two other city-states that were fairly powerful that are mentioned here. Coringuaro is one of them, and I'm not entirely sure where Coringuaro is. I can't find it on any colonial map, but it was on the mainland. And their king was Chanchori. And then there was another one named, what is it? Tariaran. Am I pronouncing that right? I can never tell with these. Tariaran.
You would be the one who know if you're pronouncing it right.
Right. And their lord was named Zurunban. So these three city-states had each controlled their own little fiefdom. They were all kind of equal in power. Well, the Chichimecs start settling along the southern end of the lake, and eventually at this point, the Lord of Shadok, Caricaten, finds out that the Chichimecs had, married off this daughter, and he married off the daughter of one of these fishermen, and so he calls the fisherman into his court and says, did you give one of your daughters to the Chichimecs? And apparently the fisherman tells the king that the Chichimecs kidnapped her. Which I want to be clear, they might have, right? I mean, the story makes it sound like he gave it to her, and then later said that they kidnapped her, but we're getting the Chichimex version of the story, so it's quite possible that, they did.
It's sort of a he said.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so they, the Lord of Sherlock, Kadikaten, thinks about this and goes, "Oh, this could be a problem. Like, a lot of my subjects have daughters. If they're kidnapping daughters, this could, cause some serious issues, with, on the island." So he decides to try to reach out to them, and he calls over these two Chichimec brothers, and has them come to the island, and he basically gives them a makeover. He dresses them up the way nobility in the region dressed. He cuts their hair, because apparently the Chichimecs had long hair. He gives them golden tweezers, the bronze tweezers, to hang around their neck, which is a sign of nobility. They use these for serving tobacco.
And to be clear, these are kind of more the axe-shaped tweezers. I can put up a picture. Yeah, you probably put up a picture, or I can put up a picture of kind of how they look. They're not how we think of tweezers today. They're pretty elaborate.
They are pretty elaborate. They're used for ceremonial. I mean, it's used for serving tobacco. Tobacco consumption was a big part of their culture. So they're not really designed for pulling splinters out or whatnot. but yeah, so he decks them up in this elaborate regalia and is basically setting them up to granting them these two Chichimec brothers as the official. Giving them all the signs of nobility in office, and then in the process of giving them some daughters and getting them some royal marriages, and basically respecting them and treating them like equals. Now, what ends up happening though is Chanshori, who is the Lord of Koringuero, one of these other city-states, finds out what's going on, and he sends a messenger over to Kadikaten and basically berates him for entertaining these Chichimecs. He's like, these people are vagabonds. Yeah, they're these. Why are you doing this? These are vagabonds. He's like, you should not be seen associating with them. This is beneath you, and gives them this whole spiel. So Kadikaten apparently listens to them and very unceremoniously strips them of all of the stuff that they'd given them and kicks them off the island. But then when the Chichimec brothers go back to the mainland, they do something rather unusual, and it might not have been that unusual for the time, but they appear to be one of the first people that did this. They decide to set up their community to model it on the Ireti form of government that the local settled people were using. They basically build a city-state. They set up temples. They build pyramids. They instill themselves as lords. Basically, try to model their own society on the settled people's society.
Kind of a win in Pátzcuaro.
Yeah, right, exactly. So what ends up happening then, though, is that at this point, Chanshori, who is the Lord of Koringuero, who is the guy that talked the islanders into kicking the Chichimecs out, decides this is not a good thing, because he's realized he's made enemies of them by doing this, and he sort of says that because Chichimecs always know how to hold a grudge, they're going to remember that I stripped them of all their stuff, and decides that he should have, instead of kicking them out of the islands, they should have just killed them. And so he decides that, well, if they're turning themselves into a city-state and they might become a threat to us, we should just eliminate them now. So Chanshori declares war, and he does this by telling them, I'm going to give offerings to my gods for success in battle. I suggest you do the same, and we'll meet you here, meet in battle. And they meet at a place called Ataquaro.
Now, mind you, are they declaring war kind of independently, or are they backed up by other groups in the lake area? Or
at this point, it just looks like it's Pátzcuaro versus Koringuero. So it's the Chichimecs versus Chanshori, and the other factions are not involved in this early conflict. But the two Chichimec brothers, Pawakume and Vapeani, are wounded in this battle, but they survive, and they go back, and because they survive, the Lord of Koringuero is even more worried now because he realizes he's attacked them and let them live, and they're going to remember this and hold a grudge. So he decides to try to eliminate them again. But again, they emerge victorious. So then he does something that's very much in line with what we see in later history, which is a very cloak and dagger way to eliminate enemies. He goes to the islanders who had been neutral in this conflict, and he says, "Listen, you guys we're connected through royal marriage, and we need to work together to eliminate these Chichimecs." So he has the islanders send out a message to the Chichimec lords saying, "Hey, you remember all those women that we, married you to when you stayed at our island briefly before we kicked you out? Well, they all miss you, and We feel bad about what we did. We want to return our daughters to you so that you could, have them as wives and return the royal marriage to the way it was supposed to be. Why don't you come out to the islands and we'll settle things. And so the two brothers, pack up and they head off towards the islands. But it was a trap. They did this, and the warriors of Coringuero were laying in ambush, just waiting until the Chichimec lords left the city with like a small escort. And they ambushed them. I believe they pretty much die immediately. Vapeani dies immediately. Pawakume is wounded and flees up into the mountains, but the soldiers from Coringuero chase him down and kill him too.
It's basically kind of a massacre.
Yeah, it was. And this was something that was not lost on the rest of the town. The second most powerful group in the city were the high priests, and this is again fitting in with the Ireti model of government that was in the rest of the area. The high priests of Pátzcuaro then meet with Caricaten, the lord of Shadakcuaro, and basically publicly accuse him of murdering their lords. They present the lord of Shadakcuaro with some gifts, and then after he accepts the gifts, they basically publicly say, "You're responsible for the deaths of our lords." And he then tries to return the gift, but they say, "No, keep it." And he's like, "Look, I didn't do this. This was Coringuero." And it's like, "But that doesn't matter. You were the bait for the trap. You lured them into this. You're responsible." And this is important because the second generation is the one that's where the bulk of the conflict takes place.
So the war is basically over at that point.
Right. This conflict is over, this particular one. However, these two Chichimec
There's
brothers,
a bit of resentment.
Yes, there's a lot of resentment. These two Chichimec brothers have 3 sons. Setako and Aramen are the sons of Wapeani, and Pawakume has a son named Teriakuri. Teriakuri was the youngest of these three heirs, and because he was young, he was still like a little kid when this happened. I mean, they don't give us how old he was, but it makes it clear that he was, way too young to actually assume any responsibility. So the priests raise Teriakuri, and they raise him throughout his entire life as a kid, through his whole childhood. These priests are instilling in him this sense of vengeance. They basically berate him over and over again. They would take him up to the top of the pyramid at Pátzcuaro, and they would point out other communities that you could see in the lake, and they'd see that town over there, they killed your father. See that town over there, they killed your uncle. And they would he'd go through the list, and they would even take it a step further. They'd point out the island of Shadakcuaro, and there was a pyramid on top in ancient times, and they'd point it out and they'd say, "See that pyramid right over there? They sacrifice people on that pyramid, and if you don't grow up to be the lord you're expected to be, they're going to sacrifice you too."
Yeah, I'm sure anyone who studies, Carthaginian and the Punic Wars is thinking definitely of kind of Hannibal and his family at this point.
Yeah, no, I definitely could have drawn that analogy myself. It's very similar, and because they were priests, they were making him all of his daily chores. He would do things like, he would have to go bring firewood offerings to the temples. And they said, while you're doing this, while you're tending to the temple fires, sit and meditate on how one day you're going to take revenge. And whenever he was misbehaving, the priest would grab him by the ears and yell at him and say, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you a lord yet? I thought you were a lord, not some common boy. When are you going to grow up and take revenge for your parents?" So they beat this into him, and he seems to internalize it a lot. I mean, I think it's a big point of understanding his character. And he also develops this sort of extremely negative attitude towards the other elites. When his brothers were sort of getting into the local elite party culture and going out and drinking and stuff, or I should say his cousins, because they're technically the other brother's sons. And his older cousins would go out drinking, and he would be like, as the younger cousin, berating them, saying, "You should be, instead of going out drinking, you should be bringing firewood for the temples and taking care of your sacred obligations." And of course, it didn't take long before they would just leave him behind because they didn't want to have to deal with his constant, complaining. But he becomes this extremely conservative character who's he seems to see himself as extremely self-righteous. He sees himself as almost divinely ordained that someday he's going to avenge what happened to his father. And as soon as he gets old enough to become a lord, he decides to take measures into his own hands. So at some point he's teenager or young adult, and he decides to move against Shadakcuaro.
So what is actually his authority at this point? Does he have a specific position? Who is the ruler of Pátzcuaro at this time?
Yeah, this is tough to say. Rulership was really defined more by membership within the lineage, and then the specific lord was the guy who was the head of the lineage. The elite lineage was derive their authority based on their ability to have access to the gods. So, they have these gods that exist. There's like 3 different dimensions that they're mentioned as existing in. There's the gods of the sky, there's the gods of the underworld, and then there's the gods of the 4 quarters, which are the gods that exist in the mortal world. But regardless of whatever dimension they exist in, all gods have a physical body. There's a physical object in each of the temples that is believed to be a physical embodiment of the god. And the god that the Chichimecs worshipped, Kurikawari, had a physical embodiment in this stone. And there's actually a depiction of the stone in the historical source. It looks like a red and white teardrop-shaped rock that's got like some sort of spiral patterns on it. I don't know what it is. It obviously hasn't survived to present day. So
I was about to ask, we don't have it now, do we?
No, of course not. In the Spanish, we're very quick to destroy those things. But but physically controlling this stone was what allowed someone to claim lordship.
Which I assume, the very devout raised by priests, Tarascans, had a bit of an advantage there.
Right. So he definitely. It sounds like he became the nominal lord, even though he was the youngest of the 3. So I'm not entirely sure why that worked out that way, but it sounds that way. But he becomes a young adult, tries to take revenge, and the way he does this is he goes around. So Shadakwaro had all these farming communities on the mainland because, like I said, it's a largely urban center on an island where you don't have any space for farmland, and so he starts attacking these farming communities, and he doesn't actually attack them, but what he does is he has his soldiers build a bonfire on the outskirts of all these farming communities, then pile a bunch of leaves and stuff on top, and he places an arrow on top of each bonfire, and then he lights them off one by one. And when the people in this little village or whatever see the smoke coming from this bonfire, they realize, oh man, this is an attack, and so they pack up and run away. And they moved to the next town, and then he would go to the next town and light it up. And it eventually got to the point where these farmers were fleeing to the islands because they couldn't get away.
So who is accompanying him on this? Because it almost sounds like he's doing it by himself.
No, well, it's depicted that way, but it's pretty clear he's got soldiers from the city, from Pátzcuaro. There probably weren't very many large armies. So when I'm talking about these battles here, the larger battles probably had like 1,000 people on each side, maybe a little more. Smaller battles might have as many as a few dozen, but I think your typical one might have like a couple hundred.
Yeah. Do we have an estimate for kind of the population of the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin at this point, or?
No, we do not.
Okay.
The old estimates, which are probably wrong, posit that the average community had 3,000. The average city had about 3,000 to 5,000 people in it, which is almost certainly too low. I think that's not correct. So we don't know. There's not really any good estimates. But if I just had to just ballpark it, I would suggest that some of the larger cities in this area, the largest ones probably had like 10,000 at most.
Okay, you're now officially on record as putting that, so just keep.
Oh Jesus, yeah. Well, I'm planning to at least start redoing some of the population estimates in light of new evidence. So those numbers are almost certainly going to change, depending on how that turns out. But it hasn't been done yet, so no one knows. But he's
all the outskirt people are fleeing back to the mainland, or fleeing from the mainland to the
islands.
Island city. Yeah.
And the Lord of Shadakwaro then decides to, okay, we need to deal with this. This guy's clearly belligerent. This young Chichimec lord, he's obviously pissed about what happened to his father. So they send. This is where the story gets really morbid. They send us a messenger to this king Zurunban, who's the king of another city-state, Tariran, which is it's one of the other city-states I mentioned. So the king of Tariran is Zurunban, and he basically laughs at the embassy and says, this is your fault. If you didn't want this to happen, you should have killed him when he was an infant and thrown his body in the lake. But instead you killed his parents and let him live, and now he's pissed. And
he's the Tarascan Batman at this point.
Yeah, exactly. My parents are dead. Yeah, but he basically says, okay, fine, I'll help you. So he takes his high priest, Naka, who, again, the high priest in these communities was kind of like the second in charge of these.
Similar to the Siwakwat among the Aztecs.
Right. I mean, they would often have like a separate religious bureaucracy, like the priests and the stuff were separate from the nobles, but they were both hereditary positions, and they worked very closely together. So the priests were often like the high priest was often like the number 2 in the community. And so he sends his high priest, a guy named Naka, out. And Naka's job is first to go to Coringuaro, which is another one of these city-states. That's the one who actually killed Teriakuri's father and uncle, and ask them for help. And then on his way back, Naka is to stop in the various farming communities and towns in the area and raise troops to go confront Teriakuri. So Teriakuri, however, Naka on his way out passes through another community, and he stops in this community, and the lord of that community gives him some food, and they talk, and Naka sort of spills the beans on what he's doing and how he's going out to go raise troops. And so this lord of this community happened to be friendly with Pátzcuaro, so they sent a messenger to Teriakuri and let him know, hey, just to let you know, the Lord, Zurunban sent out his priest Naka, who's going around, community to community and raising soldiers. So Teriakuri decides to lay an ambush for Naka to kill him before he can raise an army and buy Teriakuri a little more time. He sends some of his soldiers out to go wait in the road that they know he's going to be passing from. They send some spies to kind of find out which direction he's going. And as he comes by, he sort of stops by. There's this weird little awkward conversation where he sees these Chichimecks standing around with bows and arrows, and he's like, "Oh, what are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're out hunting. What are you doing?" And Naka's like, "Oh, I'm going to market." And there's
very believable on both sides, yes.
Yeah. And so they're like, "Okay, well, goodbye." And Naka starts walking away, and as he's walking away, one of the Chichimecks pulls out an arrow and shoots him in the back. And they take this is the really messed up part of the story. They take
I study people whose origin story involves skinning people. So
this is on par with that. They take Naka back, and Teriakuri has Naka cut up into pieces and cooked. Now, cannibalism was part of a ritual thing done with human sacrifices in this culture, just like in other parts of Mesoamerica, in that it was eating a human sacrifice was considered to be a normal, as a normal part of religious ritual. But eating human flesh outside of the context of this ritual still had a lot of the taboo connotations that we would attribute to cannibalism.
So this isn't just normal practice. This is an abomination, even within the the framework of there actually being human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism.
Right. This is totally taboo in any way. So what he does though is he cooks Naka, cuts him up into pieces, then he puts the pieces of Naka's flesh in baskets, and sends it to all of his enemy lords, and tells them that it was a human sacrifice, which is a captive slave that they'd sacrificed. And of course, according to the sources, when they give them the food to the lords of these other cities, they're drunk because they're classic Tarascan nobility.
As you do, yeah.
Right, that's part of the package. So he gives them these baskets full of Naka's meat and tells them it's a sacrifice. And then their instructions of these messengers who are bringing these baskets is they're to wait and to make sure that they can physically see them eat the flesh. Then they're to leave. And as they were leaving, they stopped by another messenger that they had sort of left on the outskirts of town and said, "Okay, go for it." So this other messenger who was waiting on the outskirts of town then would splash water on his face to make it look like he was sweating, run up to them frantically and out of breath, and say, "Stop! Don't eat the meat! It's not a sacrifice! It's Naka!" And
so we've gone from Batman to Titus Andronicus at this point.
Right, exactly. And the other lords were that when this happened started. Immediately, once they realized what had happened, they started vomiting. And the ones that couldn't vomit were sticking their fingers down their throats, trying to get them, to puke the stuff up. This, of course, immediately incenses everyone into attacking.
It's some sort of retaliation.
Right. It incenses everyone into attacking Teriakuri. And so they send all of them send as much as they can throw at him. And Teriakuri is unable to do anything to stop them because sure, the Chichimecks that he's got with him are, they're good archers, they're good fighters, but he's outnumbered quite a bit. And so they start taking communities subject to Pátzcuaro, and Teriakuri is unable to defend them. And once this happens, his cousins, Setcoco and Aramen, the other Chichimec lords, they decide to take their people and leave him because they realize that this is an unwinnable situation, and he's put them in this conflict where he can't win.
So he's kind of, bitten off more than he can chew, and the people he thought he could rely on are saying, you brought this on yourself.
Right, exactly. So what they do is they physically split the deity stone of Kurikawari. Each of them breaks a small piece off, and Setcoco and Ottoman go separately. And they're all three of them, Tediacudi, Setcoco, and Ottoman, are forced into exile. They all lose their exit. The other islanders and their allies drive them out. And Ottoman is killed almost immediately after because he happened to be, like I mentioned, he was sleeping with the Lord of Sherlock, his wife.
Yeah.
And so the Lord of Sherlock has him assassinated.
Yeah, once you lose that protection. Yeah.
Right.
Good.
Setcoco, I'm not entirely sure what happened to him, but he would die in exile. Tediacudi, who is at this point, I mean, you remember he's still a young man. He's either a teenager or like early 20s or something. And so he takes his people and starts marching north. And he sends a messenger out to Chanchori, who's the Lord of Coringuero. And this is one of the cities that he'd been at war with. And he basically says, look, you beat me. I've lost my family's home. I don't need anything from you. All I want is permission to move my people through your territory so that we can leave and go settle somewhere else. And apparently Chanchori kind of took pity on him and said, you don't really need to go out. I'll give you some land, in my territory, and you can keep it as my vassal. I'll give you one of my daughters to marry, and you don't have
keep your enemies close in a way.
Right. So Tediacudi agrees to this and settles down outside of Coringuero and marries the daughter of Coringuero. Now, it's really interesting that we don't get this woman's name. We have all these names of these obscure characters in this story, but this woman who plays a pivotal role in the events to follow, her name is not given. She's just referred to as Tediacudi's first wife. But she and Tediacudi do not get along at all. And you got to remember, Tediacudi, like I said, is kind of this curmudgeonly character who looks down on all this drinking and carrying on and whatnot. Whereas she is, classic Tarascan nobility. She wants to go out and get drunk on an evening and have a good time and, party all the time. And so they don't get along at all. And they have a son, Kuratame, and then immediately after the son's born, she moves back to Coringuero. And he ends up going to looking for her, and eventually her father, the Lord Chanchori, sends her back and says, no, you can't abandon your husband. I don't care if you don't get along. She moves back in with him, but it doesn't take long before she starts sleeping around and starts, seeing other guys. She has a lot of these visitors come over for her festivals and stuff. And
It's not a happy marriage, in other words.
No, and Tediacudi is freaking at this point because he can't stand her. He thinks she's, just the epitome of everything that he finds that he despises in the noble culture of the region, and he can't get rid of her because it's a strategic marriage. I mean, he's married. He's in this vassal relationship with Chanchori, and if he gets rid of his Chanchori's daughter, that ends the relationship, and his people are now lose their home again, and he can't do that. So it becomes an extremely stressful situation, and eventually what he does is he goes to Zurunban, the lord of one of these other towns or city-states that I'd mentioned. And Zurunban, after meeting with him, this is where that famous incident with the bird happens, where he shoots the bird out of the tree. And Zurunban is very impressed with him, and at the end of his official meeting, Zurunban gives him two of his daughters, and so that way Tediacudi now has like another marriage alliance with a different ruler.
So he's not directly tied to this, very, very unfortunate situation.
Right, and at this point, however, when he goes back and his first wife sees these two other women that he's brought home, she's extremely livid and basically packs up and leaves for good. And she goes back to Coringuero and tells the Lord of Coringuero all this horrible stuff about Tediacudi, like how he was abusive and all that. And eventually, once this marriage alliance dissolves, the Lord of Coringuero, Chanchori, decides to attack Tediacudi immediately. And this starts a war, and the Chichimecs under Tediacudi spend most of this war retreating. They're outnumbered, they keep falling back, they retreat up into the mountains where there's not any good agricultural land, and he keeps petitioning, peace for the Lord of Coringuero, and the Lord of Coringuero keeps telling him no. And
this is opportunity to finally get rid of these people.
Yeah, and so what happens is the Chichimecs sort of set up a temporary town at a place called Uresho, and the Coringuero pursues them there, and they confront in a big battle where the it supposedly is described as an extremely bloody battle, but the Chichimecs emerge victorious. And it's described that after the battle, the priests of Teriakudi's priests spend literally the entire day from sunup to sundown sacrificing captives. So it's apparently a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
So they spend some more time moving place to place in exile, at which point, and this is a little interesting, Teriakudi gets a message from the islanders. Apparently the islanders, you remember, they were kind of a confederation of, or not really a confederation, but there was a lot of alliances between these different islands. Well, that's
one, a political bloc.
Yeah, well, that political bloc had disintegrated. The lord of the islands had died, and there was some sort of dynastic struggle between the different factions. And one of the factions had sent an embassy to Teriakudi and offered to give him back Pátzcuaro as his, seat. And this is, of course, a huge, big victory for Teriakudi. He apparently laughs when he hears this. He's like, "You're the people who kicked me out in the first place. Now you want me back." But he's like, okay. So they move back into Pátzcuaro, and it comes with big fanfare and pomp. And Teriakudi then tries to track down. So okay, I should clarify. At this point, Teriakudi's old, right? He started this as a young man who was teenager, fresh out of childhood. And now he's an old man. Yeah,
his initial attack was defeated, became a vassal, forced out, and has now kind of allianced himself back in. Mm-hmm.
And so now he's settled back in his old seat, and he decides he wants to track down the other parts of his lineage that broke off when he was forced into exile. And so both of his cousins are dead, but they left two sons, Idipan and Tangashwan. So he tries to find out what happened to these kids. And apparently what had happened is they were forced into exile. And you got to remember, these are Chichimecs who were an ethnic minority in the region. So they were technically nobility, but they had no kinship ties to draw on elsewhere in the basin. It's not like if the Lord of Sherlock is forced into exile, Sherlock has all these kinship relations with other lords in the basin because they've been intermarrying with each other for a long time. So they could kind of go live with some of them and draw on that. But these two nephews, Idipan and Tangashwan, their parents had died in exile, and they had no house to tie them to, and supposedly they had just fallen into destitute poverty. According to the sources, they were begging in the market, asking for food and stuff. And so he finds them, brings them back, gives them each a plot of land, and sort of sets them up as lesser nobility. And then Teriakudi decides now's the time to retire. There's a common custom in this region where a lot of times succession happened when a lord died. The members of the lineage would vote and sort of decide amongst themselves who was going to succeed the previous ruler. But what happened a lot of times what happened is that the older king would sort of pick a successor, groom him, and then abdicate before he died, so he could sort of oversee the process of succession.
Yeah, kind of like, you can still vote on this, but you're voting this way. Come on, let's face it.
I mean, you can sort of, that way there's no question, what's going to happen. And plus the older king can sort of still be around to advise the younger king while he's learning the ropes. So he goes out and reaches out to his son Kuratame, who was the son of his first wife, this woman from Koringuero.
The unknown first wife, yeah.
Yeah, and she lives in So she was living in Koringuero, and Kuratame was living with her. And so he sends a message to Kuratame and says, okay, I'm ready to abdicate my throne to you, want you to take over, let's come meet and we can talk about it. And apparently, and again, fitting with the theme, Kuratame, his son, had grown up in the culture of Koringuero and was a notorious alcoholic. just getting drunk all the time, having a good... And so he rejects the first meeting place because they don't have any. He says they don't have any pulque there. We need to go someplace where we can, have a steady supply of pulque. And so they end up meeting somewhere else, and they meet at this town during a festival. And Teriakudi gets there in the evening and is scheduled to meet with his son Kuratame the next morning. Well, they meet. It's got to be like 10 a.m. or something, and Kuratame shows up to the meeting already drunk. He had apparently woken up early that morning to start drinking, and by the time the meeting had happened, he was just plastered.
You got a pregame.
Yeah, exactly. So he wanders in kind of like, it describes him as kind of like dancing and stuff, and he comes in and sits down, and and says something like, "Father, I'm glad you've come. I want to talk to you." And Tediocrates, of course, in kind of a foul mood at this point because his son's, showing up to the meeting drunk, and says, "Really? What did you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about how my enemies have wronged me my entire life and how we're gonna, plan to take revenge on them? And because otherwise, what else is there to talk about?" And this sort of starts this big hissy fit where Kuratame says something to the effect of, "Is this man talking to me? I'm sorry, I thought I was the king now. I thought you abdicated. I'm the king, you're not the king, so what do you get to talk, how do you get to talk to me like this?" And it starts this whole, feud between them. Nevertheless, Tediocrates had abdicated his throne, so Kuratame takes over as the king of Pátzcuaro, and Tediocrates sort of retreats to a barrio to sort of live out his days in the suburbs, kind of like as a retirement home kind of thing. So
what is the state of Pátzcuaro in the kind of broader political sense at this point?
Well, at this point, it's a pretty large. I mean, it's got to be one of the larger city-states in the region. Again, there's not really any reliable population estimates, but it appears that it's comparable to Coringuaro or some of these other city-states. So it's a major.
It's become one of the more dominant polities.
Right. But he's sitting in his retirement home in the suburbs, lamenting how you kind of imagine at this point he's got to think that this is his legacy, right? He lost his family city-state when he was young and foolish, and he's forced into exile, but he managed to get it back, and that's going to be his legacy. He's willing to stop there and let that be everything, But something starts happening while he's in retirement, which is that all of his enemies, all these other kings of all these other city-states that he'd been fighting with his entire life, they all start dying, and they start dying of old age.
Oh, yeah, because he did start this when he was, a teenager.
Right, he was the young upstart kid, and all these other guys that were these older kings that were, wiser and more experienced and had all these connections. They looked at his actions and thought, okay, this young upstart needs to be put in his place, or he's going to be a problem. So they put him down. Well, now they're all dead, and he's looking at this younger generation of rulers who have taken over, and they're all kids. They're all teenagers, and they've inherited their parents' propensity for alcoholic indulgence, but don't have the mental the political skill to back it up. They don't have that savvy that their parents' generation did. And he's looking around and he realizes, if I was to try now what I tried when I was a teenager, I could just mop the floor with these guys.
It's a very literal expression of "get off my lawn."
Yeah, no, exactly. He's very much. He strikes me very much as like a curmudgeon, And so what happens is his two nephews, Idipan and Tangushwan, who remember they sort of grew up as basically homeless people and were beggars for a little while, and so they have a lot of Tediocrates' sense of I've lived a hard knock life kind
being aggrieved, yeah.
Yeah, and so they come to visit him one day, and he's having Kuratame, who's the king of Pátzcuaro, is having a festival in the city, and he invites everyone. But Tediocrates, of course, doesn't want to go because he's being an old curmudgeon. And they come to visit him. Tangushwan and Idipan come to visit Tediocrates, and Tediocrates and them have a conversation. And Tediocrates says, "Well, why don't you guys go to the festival? You're young, enjoy yourselves." And they basically tell him, "No, we're not really into that whole scene. We're not much party people. We'd rather do more serious stuff and not get involved in that." And Tediocrates says, "Are you serious when you say that?" And they said, "Yeah." And then Tediocrates turns to all of his, servants and attendants who are with him and says, "Everyone else, get out of the room. I want to talk to my nephews in private." So what follows then is in the historical sources, this is like a 3-page speech that he gives that is like half political manifesto, half cranky old man ranting about kids these days.
And 100% unverifiable that's how it went.
Oh, of course, and I'm sure it's not worth. This is clearly something that has been trumped up as part of the oral history that they would tell later, because it's basically a justification for the formation of the empire. They go through all of the dynasties in the Lake Basin, even ones that haven't been covered in the story up to this point, and describe how all of the older, wiser lords had died and that the generations had become decadent with time, and how they weren't fulfilling any of their sacred obligations to the gods. They weren't caring for their people. They were just using lordship like it was a game to go get drunk and party all the time, and they were squabbling and fighting amongst each other, and none of them were actually doing their fit duty.
So in some sense, it's a backwards explanation for what came later.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so Tediacuti basically ends this and says, so I asked you, what are we going to do with all of these lords, or these kings? And he says, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to kill them, and we're going to throw their bodies into the fields. There will simply be no more. We'll have one dynasty ruling the entire lake basin, and it will be us. And he outlines this plan, which is to divide the lake basin into 3 parts, and each part will be ruled by one of them. Tediacuti will take one part, Idipan and Tanguachuan will each take another part. And when Tediacuti dies, his younger son, Ikingahe, will take his seat in this sort of arrangement. So notice who's absent in this whole scheme, right, is Kuratame, his oldest son. He's not part of this. This is Tediacuti and his nephews, conspiring to sort of build their own empire separate from Kuratame's. What ends up, so they start, at the behest of they start this war. And the war is basically, Tediacuti is too old to be going out and fighting. So he's sitting at his sort of retirement home in the suburb of Pátzcuaro and coordinating with Idipan and Tanguachuan, who are sort of the field commanders. And the way they start off is they have this battle where they first capture a lord from one of the islands, a guy named Zapiwatame, and they hold him hostage. And sure enough, this provokes a response from the islands. So the islands start massing a fleet of canoes with soldiers in them to go attack the mainland and take back this captive nobleman.
What are battles looking like at this period? I mean, are we talking, of course, arrows? But I mean, are we seeing Makawits or?
No, I don't think there were a whole lot of Makawits. I think the Chichimecs used bows and arrows, and it appears that some of the islander nobility did as well. But most of the people were sort of commoners drafted into the fighting force, and they fought with things like clubs and slings, which because they didn't have the kind of military equipment and training that the commoners didn't, that you see in other parts of Mesoamerica. There was much, and there was, like I said, they were kind of small scale. The larger battles might have a couple thousand people in them.
Yeah, right.
But the Chichimecs spot the islanders coming. They had posted some scouts on top of a mountain, and around midnight they noticed 2 waves. It's like a fleet of canoes is assembling at Sharakwado, and then they start coming towards the mainland in 2 distinct waves. And so the Chichimecs lay an ambush on the bank, and as soon as the first wave lands and the warriors are starting to disembark from their canoes, they open fire with arrows and kill off the first wave. And seeing this, the second wave stops and turns back. And so they capture all of the what's great about this battle is they capture all the canoes from the people that landed. With this, they then start raiding up and down the eastern lakeshore. And at the southern lakeshore, I believe, as well. They start raiding the farming communities, and they go all the way up to the borders of Coringuaro. And at this point, one of the island communities, a community named Cuyumeo, defects over to Tediacuti's side. A lot of the people from the island physically pack up, leave the island, and come to Tediacuti and say, we don't want any part in this conflict, we're at your disposal. And Tediacuti resettles them somewhere else. So Idipan and Tanguachuan are launching these raids up and down the coast, and they're meeting periodically with Tediacuti to sort of discuss strategy and things like that. And Coringuaro then notices this expansion coming up towards their borders, and they decide to attack the Chichimecs with another fleet of canoes coming out of their city. But Idipan and Tanguachuan meet them in the lake with their canoes, and they have kind of like a naval battle. And Idipan and Tanguachuan kill most of the soldiers of Coringuaro and capture their canoes. And so now they have like the largest fleet of canoes in the lake.
Which, for a lake-based kind of, region, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, no, it gives them, the ability to move their troops more effectively. And at this point, however, Kuratame, who is officially the king of Pátzcuaro, is getting nervous because he's looking over and he sees that his father, who is supposed to be retired, is building an empire from his retirement home in the suburbs that is now starting to eclipse his own, right? So he gets nervous and he sends some messengers out to Idipan and Tanguachuan, and he sort of berates them and says, why are you doing all this? Are you hungry? Do you not have anything to do? He says, because I have some spots in my palace. One of you can be my cupbearer, and the other one can clean my chamber pot.
Just please stop conquering everything.
Yeah, right. And they found this, of course, very insulting. So they go back to meet with Tediacuti, and at this point, Tediacuti then officially sets out the rules for succession. He decides, okay, first, I'll be the head of the lineage. We'll divide it up 3 parts, like I said. I'll retain my position as head of the lineage. When I die, Ikingahe will take my seat in this alliance, and the position of head of the lineage will go to Idipan. And then when Idipan dies, the head of the lineage will go to Tangashuan, and then to Ikingahe. And so they work out the rules of succession. He breaks off a piece of the deity stone and gives it to each of them.
I'm beginning to see why the deity stone didn't survive to the present day.
Yeah, they're constantly breaking off little splinters of it to. Yeah, no, that's part of it. So they do this, and they set up this alliance. They set up this succession system, and then they dedicate a new temple and everything, and then once all of this is taken care of and the succession's fully decided, they decide it's time to get rid of Kuratame. Right, he's obviously the problem here. So Tediacuti sends a messenger to Kuratame and says, "Hey, we're fighting all these wars. We don't quite have enough troops to do what we want. We could really use your help. Do you think you could, And he makes it seem like he's trying to include Kuratame in the conquest. And so Kuratame, they ask him to come out to this field camp where they're this sort of country area. They set up a little country home. Like a ranch. They call it a ranch. I don't know, exactly what that.
Ranch or villa, whatever.
Yeah, that's sort of like a country villa kind of thing, where they're out in the field, and they say, "Come out here, we'll include you in the military campaign." So Kuratame, of course, comes out in the biggest pomp and ceremony that you can possibly imagine. He's dressed. They describe he's wearing a turkey feather cloak. He's got a jaguar pelt headband. Which you got to look at the map at where Michoacan is and look at where jaguars are. It's,
it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, so that's that's pretty obviously something very rich, and he's got like these parrot feathers in his headdress, and he's got all this jewelry, and he comes out surrounded by attendants and courtiers and all these servants, and they get on these canoes with this big ceremony and go out to this camp, and he shows up, and Tediacuti Tangashuan and Idipan, the nephews of Tediacuti, are dressed, more simply for battle, not, wearing all this elaborate regalia. But they invite him out, and they have dinner. And they're under the instructions they were given were very clear. They're not to offer him any pulque, but if he asks for it, they're to give him as much as he wants. And I almost wonder if this was sort of Tediacuti trying to give Kuratame one last chance to clean up his act. Like what if he didn't take that pulque? What if he didn't ask for it? If he just had dinner and went to bed? Would this have happened?
Yeah, we're not gonna get you drunk, but if you prove yourself to be a drunk, then
that's what's So sure enough, though, right after dinner, he says, "Hey, you guys got anything to drink?" And they're like, "Yeah, we do." And supposedly, Kuratame drinks 8 glasses of pulque, which is, it's quite a lot. If you imagine, they're like 6,000
To give another
feet.
aside, the idea in the Aztecs was that, 4 glasses of pulque made you drunk, and the 5th glass is when you became a drunk, essentially. So 8 glasses is...
It's a lot. It's a lot of booze. And so they hit a club in like some of the bushes out in this villa, and they're all sitting outside, and they're continue serving Kuratame pulque whenever he asks for it. And at one point, Kuratame, the story goes that Kuratame is talking with Idipan, and he's sipping this pulque, and he's talking and kind of gesticulating, and he's holding the pulque glass, and while he's doing this, Tangashuan grabs the club that he's hidden in the bushes and kind of walks up behind him. And Kuratame raises the cup to his lips, and Tangashuan takes the club and strikes him in the back of the neck hard. And of course, Kuratame immediately falls face forward, and then Tangashuan walks up to him again and hits him again in the back of the head. And it's a very graphic description. It says kind of blood pools everywhere, and the feathers are, all of these gorgeous parrot feathers that he's wearing, and elaborate finery is all blood stained. And the best part is that he's the king, right? So he's surrounded by all these servants and attendants and stuff.
At this point, have no idea what to do.
Right? No, they see this happen, right? They just see him getting like bludgeoned to death right in front of them. So they all stand up and start running in like different directions. And Tengishwan stands up and turns around and goes, "Hey, whoa! Where are you going? I didn't do anything wrong here. I didn't do anything to you. We were just having a discussion amongst us lords. It doesn't concern you." and sort of like talks him down. And they send a message to Tediakuti and say, it's done. He's dead. And Tediakuti says, who did it? Which one of them was the one who killed him? And they say Tengishwan. And he goes, good man, Tengishwan. So, not a whole lot of love lost between Tediakuti and his now dead son.
Yeah, obviously.
So Tediakuti then takes over, and what follows, Tediakuti takes over Pátzcuaro again as king, coming out of retirement, and with the armies of Pátzcuaro behind him, they then sort of go out and start conquering the rest of the lake basin, pretty much one by one. They all kind of fall like dominoes, and towards the very end, we were right before this major they're about to launch their all-out military campaign to start attacking not just like the outlying communities, but the city-states themselves. Tediakuti takes his sons out to a hill, and because at this point he's old and decrepit, and he's described as being in really poor health, so he's kind of thinking he might die sometime soon. And he takes his 3 heirs. At this point, there's 3 because Ikingahe, his younger son's gotten old enough to participate in the military conquest. He takes them out. He outlines the exact battle strategy that he wants them to use in every town that they're going to conquer, and then they go out and do it. And right as they're kind of like mopping up the last of the resistance, Tediakuti dies, and so he's gone. I mean, what an interesting life for a man to live, right? I mean, when you look at a lot of these conquerors that are famous for being the founders of these empires, a lot of them started young. And Tediakuti failed when he was young and didn't really succeed until he got much, much older. So, and he
had to play the long game.
Yeah, no, it's great, and it's the story is filled with so much intrigue and personal drama, but that's it. And he dies, and sure enough, it goes like he says. They divide the empire up they divide the lake basin up into 3 communities. Pátzcuaro, obviously, is one of the major seats. Iwatzio, which is a town that was founded during these wars by the Chichimecs, and Tzintzuntzan is the third of these cities that forms this sort of almost like a triple alliance in and of itself. And the seat, as each of these members of the dynasty dies, the capital moves to the city of the next member of the lineage, because each of them had been installed in a different city, and it ends up at Tzintzuntzan, and after that, Tzintzuntzan remains the capital from that point on.
So I want to go on and talk more about what happened post Tariakari's death, and how basically what we now think of as the Tarascan Empire kind of solidified. But I think what we need to do now is take a bit of a break. And there's where we'll have to leave off for this episode of the Ask Historians podcast. We'll be back in a fortnight with the part 2 of this interview with Snickeringshadow about the Tarascans. We'll be dealing a little bit more, of course, with moving forward in time, talking about their interactions with the Aztecs, the coming of the Spanish, some details about the government, the way everything, the society, and the way it progressed. But until then, if you like the podcast, please do tell some friends, tell your mother, tell your neighbors, rate us on iTunes. That gives us some sort of black magic, which lets other people you don't know about us. And if you didn't like the podcast, please don't tell anyone at all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.